Hi, my name is Lily and welcome back to my channel, and welcome to my January reading wrap-up. So in January I read 10 books of varying genre, length and star rating. So let's get straight into it and talk to you about all of the books that I read this month. The first book I read in January was The Silent Patient by Alex Michaelides, I think is how you say the name. If I am wrong, please do correct me. This is an adult thriller. I read this in paperback. It was around 340 pages and I gave it 4 stars. This is about a woman named Alicia who seemed to be living the perfect life and was an artist until one day she murders her husband and never speaks again. And we also follow Theo, who is a therapist who is coming to work at the hospital that she is currently imprisoned in, and he wants to find out what happened and why she's not talking. This is a slow burn thriller, and it has some real interesting elements in it and a really interesting late stage plot twist. I will say I predicted the plot twist, but it didn't ruin my enjoyment of the book. What I really enjoyed about reading this one is you have 4 different story timelines that you're following, essentially. So you have the flashbacks back to Alicia's life through her diary entries, and then you also have Theo's present day narrative of interviewing Alicia, trying to get to know her, and also investigating stuff around her life. And then you also have the plot line of Theo's personal life, which is kind of a separate plot line to his present day life, and you kind of are trying to figure out, why are we being told so much about Theo's day-to-day life and what's happening, and how is this all going to connect together? Honestly, I'm kind of struggling to say anything more about this book without spoilers, because it's kind of impossible to properly review this book without spoilers, and I don't do spoilers in my wrap-up videos. But if it's something that is intriguing you, I would really recommend it. I wouldn't say any of the characters in this book are particularly likeable, but that really helps itself in this book because you're not necessarily rooting for anybody and you really want to get into the dirt of what is happening here and what has gone on, especially as you start to reveal more about Alicia's past and Theo's personal life. It really gets interesting. Now, I will say this is one that I read in under 24 hours because I just kept saying to myself, just one more chapter, until it got to a point where I was like, I have to finish this book. So it's definitely one that once you start it, you're not going to be able to finish it and you'll really want to know what's happened. But it's so hard to talk about this without spoiling it. The reason I didn't give it 5 stars was because I predicted the big plot twist at the end, which isn't necessarily always a reducer for me when it comes to star ratings, but for this one I felt like I would have enjoyed it more if I hadn't figured it out, and it was a little bit too obvious for me just too soon, but it was still a very satisfying read and I really, really enjoyed it. Then I read Unmasking the Billionaire by Emma Bray. This is a short story / novella. It is about 50 something pages. I gave it 3 stars and it is an adult romance. So this one has our female main character Eve going to a masquerade ball on her birthday, which is Halloween, and while she is there, her friend decides to dare her to kiss this man across the room to try and get her out of her shell, and she has the most amazing life-changing kiss with this man and never sees him again. And then she ends up taking on a job as a sort of live-in maid for a billionaire in her local area, and perhaps is this the same man? This one, I honestly gave it 3 stars just because I felt like it just wasn't developed enough. It needed to be its own full book. It was very insta-lovey. I believe in the epilogue they kind of talk about getting married within like months. Like it's very, very insta-lovey and immediately getting together. I also found the sex scenes a little bit clunky in this book, but it was fun and it was an easy read. I enjoyed my time with it. It's really, again, hard to review this one because there's not much to review, but the characters were decently likeable. It was split POV, which I thought perhaps wasn't totally necessary. It might have been more interesting just having it from one of them, but I think if it was a fully fledged book, it would definitely need dual POV. So it's one of those where, like, if you're looking for something short and sweet and a little bit spicy just to get you through an afternoon, like, this is one to pick up. But it wasn't one that I would say like rush to go and read. I was more reading it to see if this author is a potential author for me to look into further, and I might do, but again, I'm not rushing. The next one is an e-arc from NetGalley, which I received free in exchange for an honest review. That is The Sprite and the Gardener. It is a graphic novel. This was an 89-page fantasy that I gave 4 stars. So this one, I really enjoyed it, and it is incredibly beautiful, but it just was lacking a little bit. So this one is a fantasy world in which the sprites of this world used to be the caretakers of the flowers and gardens of the world, but then when humans appeared and started creating their own gardens, the sprites kind of lost their jobs. But now we've got a new young sprite called Wisteria who is starting to question this and wants to get back to the old ways of helping the humans with their gardening, and starts to build a bond with a local gardener and discover her old ancient powers. So this one is absolutely beautiful. It's one of the most beautiful graphic novels I've ever read, but the reason it doesn't get 5 stars from me is because it felt like it needed more. I felt like there were quite a few montage scenes that were maybe 1 page with multiple panels on it about learning the magic or growing something, whereas I would have loved to see that fleshed out and to see the bond built between the human and the sprite a bit more, and to see kind of more of how the magic was learnt. But I still thought it was a lovely, lovely story, and I really enjoyed the characters and how each of the sprites looks incredibly different and with really intricate detail, as did the humans. Again, if you're looking for something short and sweet, this is one that I would really recommend reading. I'm intrigued to see if there's going to be more in this series or more from these authors in general, because again, it was so beautiful. I would love to see more from them, and I think they have really great potential, and if they were to be able to write longer form graphic novels, I would be probably giving them 5 stars. Now, I thought I would talk about my DNFs in this video as well. So my first DNF of January was Hold Back the Tide by Melinda Salisbury. This is about a young girl named Alva who lives in the Scottish Highlands with her father. And many years ago, her mother disappears and she believes that her father murdered her. And it is about her kind of living in this world where she is living in terror of her father but must survive because it's the Scottish Highlands and it is in some historical period, so she cannot escape. But she is actually currently planning to escape when she is of age, but during this period of time when she's planning to escape, dark forces begin to stir, and with the lake retreating, things are starting to get very suspicious. So this one I DNF'd because I was really struggling to get into it. I loved the idea of it. The atmosphere was quite cool, but I was really struggling because there was just no world building in this book. It's an incredibly small book. So according to Storygraph, this book was 384 pages long, which I think might be a mistake because it definitely felt like it was smaller than that when I was holding it. It's a very small book, very thin book, and the author's trying to do a lot in a very small book, but also not doing a lot for the most of it. So I think I got about 100 pages in, and not a lot had happened. It was just a bit strange, and I was really struggling because it's hard to tell. When people live in these remote areas like the Scottish Highlands, there is a chance that they are still living with older methods, such as things like older forms of light and heat and food gathering. So at first I wasn't really sure what time period we were in, because it could have been someone living in a remote town that didn't have electricity access or water mains access, you know. So it was really difficult, and the author never establishes the time period for you. You're supposed to kind of pick it up from the clues in the text, which took a really long time for me to understand, and because of that it was quite difficult to then hold that context in mind, because ultimately, the time period a book is set in, if it's historical, really impacts how you view what's happening to the character and how the characters are interacting. Because in different time periods, especially here in the UK, in different time periods there was different politics between different groups, and women were treated differently, children and young girls were treated differently. So it was really hard to understand, should I be shocked by this happening, or was this normal for the era? Because I didn't know the era. And that was one of the biggest things that I struggled with. But then there's also a real lack of world building in the sense of the community. There was a lot of telling us but not showing us, but also just a lack of explanation of anything. So I was finding it really hard to understand what the relationships were like between the different characters, why I should care about these characters and what roles they played for each other. And that just meant that I was really struggling to care. And the first half of the book is so unbelievably slow. I was really struggling because like nothing was happening, and we had this sense of Alva hating her father, blaming him for her mother's disappearance, being fearful of him, and we're being told all of this, but we're not really being shown any reason to be fearful of him. He isn't a particularly imposing character. In fact, for a lot of it, he's not even there. We're just told that we should be scared of him. And I think ultimately it was just kind of an interesting concept, but not very well executed for me. I did go and read the plot summary to find out what happens in the rest of this book, and she could have started that sooner. If she started bringing in some of those elements sooner, I would have enjoyed it more, because I thought this was just a horror book about a girl, or a thriller about a girl growing up with a murderous father. And it wasn't until I was on Storygraph and I saw it tagged as fantasy and I was like, oh, so there's a fantasy element in this too. But that doesn't come in until quite late, even though the fantasy element is very key to this story. So ultimately, I think it's one of those books where if it had been rewritten and rebalanced and like kind of restructured, it would have been a very good book for me, but I ultimately didn't enjoy it. My next read was Meat Market by Juno Dawson, and this is actually my winner for Best Book of January, so you know I loved this. This is a young adult contemporary that's around 400 pages and I gave it 5 stars. So this is not my first Juno Dawson, so I was fully expecting to love this book, and when I was talking to my friend Ian and we brought up the idea of buddy reading this, I knew this was going to be a real hit for me and I was so looking forward to it. Now, my copy of this has a very not so helpful blurb. I did not know what this book was about at all before going into it, because that was all I had, and even when I saw that Storygraph did have a more detailed blurb, I decided to go into it blind. So I'm going to give you a fairly minimal summary of this book, but essentially this is about a teenage girl who is scouted while on a school trip to become a model, and it is about her entering into the model industry, becoming this rising star, and seeing both the good and the bad parts of the modelling industry and how it affects her and the people around her. This is an incredibly emotional, harrowing read that really makes you question everything you thought about how young women are treated. This really explores the reality of the fashion and modelling industries and how the women and young girls in the industries are exploited. And one of the key things that they really talk about is exploitation and sexual assault, but also the abuse that happens that is outside of those two main things that I think people do know about. So they bring in the fact that, you know, there are rules about the minimum age to be working in the modelling industry, but how modelling agencies are getting around those rules and recruiting much younger girls and influencing them very, very young. It talks about the drug use and abuse in the industry, about the eating disorders that girls are pushed into, and they also have sections that kind of look into how the men in the industry are treated, because there are men that she meets in the industry. And it also has a very interesting exploration of how this impacts her life outside of the modelling industry, because at the start of the book she is at school, she is a teenager, she has a boyfriend and a group of friends, and it's very interesting to see how all of those things are impacted by her career as a model. Now, this book does have a lot of trigger warnings that go along with it. I'm not going to list them here because I think some of them are spoilers, and if you don't need trigger warnings, it would be better to go into the book not knowing it was coming, because it has more of an impact. But if you do need them, I think you should really look up trigger warnings for this book, because there are a lot in it. I think you can probably guess some of them with it being about the modelling and fashion industry, but some may surprise you. It's just absolutely heart-wrenching to read, because you really fall in love with our main character Jana, and you just want the best for her. And so seeing her make the decisions that she makes, seeing her being manipulated and influenced in the way that she is really, really difficult. And you just kind of want to scoop her up and save her and take her somewhere better. I also really enjoyed her friends in the book. They're not the most present, and there is a big cast of side characters that come and go throughout different phases of her life in the modelling industry, and it totally makes sense that a lot of them aren't present a lot. But I loved seeing how different people reacted in different ways and how they all felt like individuals, and I could kind of predict like when something bad was happening, I'd be like, that friend's going to help her and that friend's not, because they were such strong characters and they had clear personalities from the beginning. And what I really enjoyed is this book is ultimately about finding the power to protect yourself and others, and also about the forgiveness that you can give other people. And it's just a really beautiful book that is incredibly sad, but so worth reading. Okay, so I have one more DNF to talk about in January, and I'm a little bit nervous about this one, but hear me out. It's Babel by R.F. Kuang. So I'm going to start this by saying I love the premise of Babel. I loved the plot ideas of Babel. I don't disagree with anything that's happened in it. I just didn't like the writing. So Babel is kind of a hybrid between literary fiction, historical fiction, and fantasy, and it is dark academia. It is about 550 pages long, and I haven't rated it because I DNF'd it. So this book follows Robin, who is orphaned in Canton, and he is then adopted by a mysterious professor from Britain who takes him back to the UK, and there he trains him in classical languages and Chinese and English so that he can enter into the College of Babel at Oxford University. And at Babel, they work to use translation magic to essentially help with Britain's colonialist ideals. And in this book, we follow Robin on this journey, and also when he discovers that there is a secret rebel group in Oxford trying to bring down Babel. So, I should say, you've probably seen the drama reviews going around TikTok and Instagram about people saying that it promotes violence, it's reverse racism, and all this kind of stuff. That's not where I'm coming from. I have read a plot summary of what happened in the rest of Babel. I finished it around halfway through. That's why I decided to do DNF. And so I've read a lot of what happened. And I don't have an issue with the plot and with what the characters do. Ultimately, that is not what my issue was. My issue is purely in the writing. So for me, I found that Babel, I read about half of it and not a lot happened in it, really. It was really difficult to get through. So I don't mind slow books. I've read slow books. I've had people in the past try to claim that I don't like character-driven books and I clearly only like fast-paced, plot-driven books, which is not true at all. Some of my favourite books are very slow. But I believe that if a book is going to be slow, what you're doing in the book needs to be furthering something, even if it's not a plot. So I think you should be furthering the characters, setting up the world, doing something, whereas I felt like Babel was just waffle. There was a lot of filler, a lot of, I think she was trying to tone set, but it just wasn't working because it was a lot of repetitive, we went to this class, then we went to this class, then we went to this class, and it just was not it. It was not it. I was waiting for something to happen either for the characters or for the story, but it was a lot of just very, very boring moving about place to place, going to classes. I tried to keep reading, but it was incredibly dense. I also found that the characters were just not particularly likable and distinguishable from each other. So I don't necessarily feel like I have to like all of the characters, but I have to have something to like about one of the characters at least, and I just didn't care. And it's not that I didn't care about their struggle, I didn't care about the individual characters. I found the rebel group very, very interesting and I wanted to know more about them, but instead we just followed Robin, who felt very two-dimensional and very plain for at least the part of the book that I was reading, and I really struggled to care about their day-to-day issues, if you understand what I mean. It wasn't that I didn't care about the racism and the colonialism, that was not what I'm saying. I just found that following him day to day was very boring because he didn't seem to have much of a personality, and I almost wanted to hear more from the rebel side than I did from what he was doing day to day. I had nothing that was keeping me wanting to read this book. I just wanted to know what happened, but not in the way that made me want to keep reading the book, in the way that made me want to look up a plot summary, which is what I did. I didn't feel invested enough in the characters as individuals to want to read their particular story, and I didn't feel invested in the plot because there just wasn't a plot. But ultimately, it's not that I thought that the book itself had bad ideas, I just thought the writing execution wasn't good for me. And it's one that I think if you enjoy that style of writing, you'll probably love this book. So it really is one of those books where it's going to be down to the writing style whether you enjoy it, because when I read the plot, I was like, if I read a book that had this plot but was written differently, I would love it. But unfortunately, the way that she had written the plot was just not for me. Okay, and then my next read was Lessons in Chemistry by Bonnie Garmus. This is adult historical fiction and it's around 400 pages. I gave it 4 stars. So this book begins in the 1960s when Elizabeth Zott is working as a chemist for a company, and it is in the era when women were not being taken very seriously. She's finding it very difficult, but then she meets Calvin Evans, who changes everything, and they fall in love and he supports her in her work. But just a few years later, she finds herself as a single mother trying to navigate the world and trying to earn enough to support her daughter. So when she is offered the opportunity to make a cooking show, she decides to go for it. So this one I gave 3.5 stars because good idea, but just didn't love the book for some reason. Now, I found this one really hard to rate because it's a very abrupt and graphic and direct book, and I just didn't like it. But I didn't not like I didn't like it, but I didn't dislike it either. It is very much a middle of the road. Like, this was a okay book, but it just didn't get me, you know? One thing that makes me really sad when I read other people's reviews is people talk about not liking Elizabeth Zott. And the reason that makes me sad is because I loved her, because I think she is the most heavily autistic coded character I have ever read in my entire life. And the same goes for her daughter Mad. So it kind of makes me sad when people say they don't like her, because she's definitely very autistic. Elizabeth is incredibly direct, abrupt. She has really very clear black and white thinking and is very rational and not particularly loving. Or at least not loving in the way that neurotypical people expect her to be. So she's not cuddly, she's not a cuddly kissy mum, but she does everything she can to make sure that her daughter has everything she needs and is happy. So she clearly does love her daughter, but it's just shown in a different way. But I really enjoyed her, actually. She was one of the shining stars, and I think that's what this book for me was about. Was I loved the characters, but I just found the story itself kind of dull. My favourite character though was the neighbour. Harriet is probably the best character in this book because she's just so funny, so down to earth, and I loved getting little glimpses into her life as well as part of this book. And I also of course love their dog 630, and getting his perspective occasionally was really cute. Whilst I did really enjoy reading this book and seeing what happened in the 1960s, seeing how women were treated and just generally seeing like what life was like back then and how Elizabeth got through it, what for me I think was lacking in this book that meant it didn't get 5 stars or higher than 3.5 for me is that I felt like this book just plods along and you're kind of expecting something to happen, expecting there to be some kind of event for this book to be about, but it never really happens. And you just kind of get to the end of the book and you're like, oh, okay. And the ending felt a bit too convenient, you know? So it just didn't do enough for me. Like, it was interesting, but I wanted more, and I was kind of surprised by the amount of hype this book got, considering I felt like it just was a bit dry. But it's a decent read, and I would encourage people to give it a go, because I feel like this is a personal taste kind of thing, but it just wasn't a shining star for me. Okay, so then I read the 4 books of the Off-Campus series by Elle Kennedy. I will go through them one by one, and they are all adult romances that vary around the 300 to 350 pages mark, and I read them all via audiobook. So the first book is The Deal, which is Hannah and Garrett's book. So in this book we have Hannah, who is very, very studious. She has a crush on one of the football players at her school, but she doesn't really know how to approach him. And then we have Garrett, who is part of the hockey team at the college, and he is like wanting to continue his dream and become a professional hockey player, but he is at risk of being kicked off the team because his GPA is dropping thanks to the class that he shares with Hannah. And so he tries to convince her to tutor him and she doesn't want to, but they come to an agreement that he will fake date her and help her build her dating and sex confidence while she tutors him to improve his GPA. So this one is like, it's mild enemies to lovers because they don't particularly like each other at the beginning, or at least Hannah doesn't like Garrett at the beginning, but it wasn't true enemies to lovers. And I gave this one 4.5 stars because I loved it. So it's really hard to review romances because I feel like a lot of the time it was so cute, I loved them. But what I really liked about this one was Garrett. I feel like the male main character is the biggest influence for me on what I rate a book, and I just adored him and how he looked after Hannah, how respectful he was of her, and it was so cute. It was so adorable. They were so sweet together, and I actually kind of believed more in their third act breakup than I do normal third act breakups. So yeah, there's not much more to say about this one other than I just thought it was adorable. Then we have The Mistake, which is Logan and Grace's book. So in this one, Logan is a slightly older person in college, and he is known for being this playboy, and he ends up hooking up with Grace. And Grace nearly loses her virginity to him, but backs out at the last minute after he massively upsets her. So then Grace comes back in her second year and is determined not to let him walk all over her, and he has to earn his way back into her heart, but he also has some secret troubles of his own. So this one was more heartbreaking than the first one. It still got 4.5 stars because I loved Garrett again. He was kind of the shining star, and I love the character development in this book because this one has a really big focus on Garrett's hidden issues and how he deals with them. And I thought it was really interesting to see how he goes about that and how it changes, and just seeing him develop was really sweet, but also they were a very cute couple, and I found it really, really funny the stuff she makes him do to get back with her. So ultimately a very enjoyable, very sweet, but kind of sad little romance. Then we have The Score, which is Dean and Ali's book. So this one is about Ali, who's freaking out about graduation coming up soon and decides to blow off some steam after a long-term relationship breakup by sleeping with Dean, who is the player of the hockey team. And Dean then decides he doesn't want to be a player anymore and he wants to be with her, but she's not having any of it, so he must try and win her heart. Kind of a similar vibe to book 2, but it is less kind of redeeming himself for a mistake and more trying to convince her that he's okay. So this one was another 4.5 star rating. I don't honestly remember much about this one, which is kind of sad. Also means I probably should reread it soon, but it was cute and it was funny, and I really liked Ali in this book. She was the shining star for once. I loved her kind of sassiness and her independence, but also the very realness of her freaking out about what to do after college. And then we have The Goal, which is the final book, and this one is Tucker and Sabrina's story. I gave this one 4 stars. I didn't love it as much because of the tropes. So this one is about Tucker and Sabrina, who are having kind of a casual hookup, regular hookup situation going on, until one day Sabrina finds out she got pregnant. And as much as Tucker is kind of settled with the idea that he's never going to be a professional hockey player, and he's kind of happy to sit in the background, he is not willing to sit in the background when it comes to being a father. But Sabrina's not really willing to let him take an active role as he wants and does not want to be in a relationship with him, so he's really got to fight for himself here. So this one, I just didn't love the pregnancy trope. I know it's straight in the blurb, it wasn't a surprise pregnancy, which would have really put me off, but I just didn't love the pregnancy itself. I found it kind of weird to read about college students having a baby, and I just couldn't get into the story, especially because their fling is kind of pre-established at the beginning of the book, so I didn't really see them kind of sparking. But it was interesting and I did like them. I did really like Tucker, and I really felt for Sabrina, who has a very difficult home life in this book, so I was really feeling for her and wanting the best for her, but it just didn't have the same kind of energy as the first 3 books for me, and that's why I didn't like it as much. And the final book for January will be a quick one to talk about, and that is Spare by Prince Harry. I'm not going to tell you anything about this book particularly. I don't have any interest in joining the discourse around this book. I'm not rating it, not giving it a full review. I'm going to swap because my hand's aching already. This one was just, I read it out of curiosity because it's getting reported everywhere, especially in the UK. If I'm going to have to hear about it, I'd rather read it firsthand than read what journalists are like cherry picking from the book. And I feel like if people are forming opinions on this book based on what other people are cherry picking, that's not a very good approach to do this. Like, why would you do that? Go to the source. You can get it from libraries, I'm sure. Like, it's not going to be hard to get this for free if you really want to read it and don't want to give any money. It's well written, not as scandalous as people are expecting it to be. That's all I have to say, really. So those were all of the books that I read in January. I had not as good a month as I was expecting, which is going to be shocking because I know 10 is a lot for some people, but like last January I read 23 books and I read double the number of pages that I read this month, so I am a little bit sad. I just got quite slumpy in January and I was also very busy, so I didn't read as much as I was hoping to, but I still read some pretty good books, and I love that I discovered Elle Kennedy. I hadn't heard of her before I listened to these books. I think I picked up the first book in the Off-Campus series on a whim because it was an Audible sale item, and I'm glad I did. So hopefully things will get a bit better and I'll read a bit more in February and try and keep on top of my reading goal, but ultimately it was a pretty good month. I'd love to hear what any of your thoughts are on these books, except Spare. Please don't start Spare discourse in my comments, I'm not interested. But all the other books, if you have any thoughts on them, please do let me know. I'd love to hear about them. And also let me know what you read in January. Did you have any particular highlights and any books you'd recommend to me from that? So thank you so much for watching. If you like this video, please give it a like and consider subscribing to see more content from me. All of my social media links are in the description below. And if you'd like to leave me a comment to let me know you're here, leave me a hockey stick emoji in the comments below. Thank you again for watching. Bye!